was becoming kind of a problem. We had a variety of minor
Hey, Cynthia. And you just
Hey, Steven.
switched.
Yeah.
How
How's it
are you?
going?
I'm doing okay.
Good.
So I have to tell you, my power just flickered on and off.
Uh-oh,
Yeah,
Oh boy.
that's always good news.
yeah.
Where are you, Steven?
So I'm in Rincon Valley.
Oh. Better than
Oh.
Michigan.
Yeah. In fact, tomorrow I'm scheduled to go to Michigan. My elderly father fell
Oh, no.
at the end of December, and he cracked his neck. He didn't break it completely, but he did enough damage to. He's probably going to have a permanent disability for whatever time he has left.
Oh,
And so my
no.
parents had put off the plan for this thing for so long, and so my brother's coming from Boston and I'm coming from California, and we're going to have the talk about what comes next.
Oh, that's always very hard.
Yeah.
Cynthia, as far as you can see, are we up and running?
Yeah, it looks like it. We've got 50 people waiting in, or sorry, 47
Ah, good.
attendees plus us,
All right.
who are waiting in the waiting room.
They're not in a waiting
So
room.
far.
They're not in a, we don't have a waiting room. They had to register.
Or whatever. Okay, whatever it is. They're
So are they?
Somebody has asked you a question in the chat.
Yeah, I got,
Are we
there's another
supposed
one.
to?
Are we supposed to be a host?
No. What?
So this is a slightly different Zoom. This is the webinar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, so I assume, okay, so those 50 folks can actually hear us conversing right now, I
Yes.
think, and see us.
Oh.
I didn't realize that.
Great. Well,
All right.
everybody knows about my father.
Okay, so I'm glad Steve's got the main screen. I hope we are speaking to everyone, and I welcome you all to the Holocaust and Genocide lecture series for 2021. I know that we're not in our typical form, but we're lucky to be here in any form at all. And I'm very pleased again to welcome one of our standard bearers, Professor Stephen Bittner of Sonoma State, our own history department, who has served this lecture series very well in this capacity for several years. For those of you who don't know him, Professor Bittner received his BA from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and subsequently his PhD from the University of Chicago. In addition to many articles and reviews, Dr. Bittner is the author of Whites and Reds, A History of Wine in the Lands of Tsar and Commissar, which was published this year by Oxford University Press. He has also published The Many Lies of Khrushchev's Thaw by Cornell, and the editor of Dmitry Shepalov's memoir, The Kremlin Scholar. Professor Bittner has a couple of different projects, usually up in the air or soon to come down, currently underway, including a history of the Soviet presence in Antarctica, which is very intriguing, and an investigation, also intriguing, of the places where refugees from Bolshevism and Nazism met. Dr. Bittner has been the recipient of grants and fellowships from the Social Science Research Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies. We welcome you again, Steve. Thank you for being here.
Hello. This is very strange because it seems like I'm only speaking to two people. But I understand that there are probably 73 other people, and that number is rising. And so I think if I understand correctly, I can share my screen, Diane.
Yes.
Is that?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So, host disabled participant screen sharing, it says.
Oh no. I don't know how.
So bear with us while we get this figured out here. So I think what you have to do is you have to go to my photo, the little three dots on my photo, and say that I'm co-host.
Right. Make co-host. Brilliant.
Okay, it does say I'm co-host. Okay, excellent. So I will share my screen. So now you're seeing my calendar and my two
Aw.
kids when they were much younger.
Cute.
Yes, they are not always so loving. So let me put my slideshow up here. Okay. And Diane, I think you can spotlight me as well. And that means that I'll be the person whose picture is in the.
That's already the case. We only see
Okay,
you.
okay. So let me see, pin. So here we go. Pin, spotlight for everybody. Okay, okay, okay. Well, cancel. So as Professor Parnes mentioned, I've given this talk many times over the years, but never quite in this format. So this is the first time I've given it by Zoom. But Zoom has worked its way insidiously into virtually every corner of my life in recent months. A few months ago, I attended my nephew's bar mitzvah via Zoom. And I'm not sure even the most erudite rabbis of Vilna and Odessa could ever have imagined that. And so I start this lecture by plugging the series, the lecture series as a whole, which I truly think is one of the most extraordinary classes you will take during your time at Sonoma State. And Professor Parnes mentioned that I did my undergraduate work at the University of Michigan, where my daughter is now a freshman.
Wow.
And I miss Ann Arbor quite a bit. In fact, my desire to live someplace like Ann Arbor was a big reason I became a university professor. It just seemed to be a city where everybody was living the life of the mind. And so this lecture series and the scholars it attracts and the discussions across campus that it engender are really emblematic of the sort of thing that you would find in Ann Arbor or Berkeley or Madison or Chapel Hill or New Haven or Hyde Park. And so I think we're very fortunate to have it on campus. And so I usually also admit at the outset that I'm not a historian of Germany, even though I give the historical context lecture. As some of you know, and as you probably gathered from my introduction, I'm a fan of the Soviet Union. And so I'm an outsider to the field of Holocaust history. And so when it comes to question time, if there's a question I don't know or I don't know the answer to, I will deflect that question to persons who are present, Cynthia and Diane, and I assume Barbara's out there somewhere, maybe Mirna, who know far more about this than I do. But just because I'm an outsider doesn't mean I haven't thought a good deal about the Holocaust. And in truth, there's a great deal of historical overlap or scholarly overlap in the literature on Nazism and Stalinism. And generally speaking, that they're joined by a concept called totalitarianism, which has fallen out of vogue in recent years, but I think it's still useful. It used to be the case that the word was so overused that it became devoid of meaning. But 50 years ago, it was coined by two Harvard political scientists who used the word totalitarianism to refer to governments like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany that had totalizing ambitions. These are governments that sought to control not only actions that occurred in public, but also actions that occurred in private. And then it's also the case that Stalinism and Nazism are linked by the concept of genocide, albeit less frequently and with much less consensus. And whether or not the Soviet Union was a genocidal regime remains the subject of great and really interesting debate in my field. And there are credible scholars on both sides of that debate. But I think every scholar acknowledges that the Soviet Union was highly repressive and authoritarian. So Soviet power took a very hard toll on Soviet citizens. And so I think this comparison between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, strangely, is one where the Soviet Union comes out looking comparatively good. And this speaks to one of the great ironies of 20th century history, that the Soviet Union, a communist country, saved the capitalist world from its own excesses by defeating Nazism. And as my students who were with me last year in the Soviet Union, and excuse me, last semester in the Soviet Union and World War II, whatever metric we consider, the Soviet Union was the principal victor over German fascism. And it's also true that the Holocaust was primarily an Eastern European and a Soviet event. And this always comes as a little bit of surprise to American students, because our image of the Holocaust in the United States tends to be one of Vichy collaborators in France and Anne Frank holed up in her attic in Amsterdam. But the truth is, the vast majority of persons who perished resided in the East. And so if we include lands that were partitioned by the Soviet Union in 1939, as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, about half of the victims of the Holocaust were Soviet citizens. And indeed, the heartland of European Jewish life, what we call the old Russian Pale of Settlement, let me move myself out of the picture there, these lands were almost entirely within the Soviet Union. They comprised Ukraine, Belarusia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And remember, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, these became part of the Soviet Union in 1939. Indeed, they had been part of Tsarist Russia up until 1917. And I'll just point out this map here, the map of the old Tsarist Pale of Settlement. This was the epicenter of Jewish life in Europe. This is where the vast majority of European Jews lived. And in these dark territories, Warsaw Oblast and Grodno Oblast, the Jewish population exceeded 17% of the total local population. And in this part of Europe, what the historian at Yale, Tim Snyder, is called the Europe's bloodlands, that part of Europe that lay between Hitler and Stalin. These lands were left almost completely devoid of Jews at the end of World War II. So I think this is what qualifies me to speak about the Holocaust, despite being an outsider. Now, if I were to ask you what the Holocaust was, I'm confident nearly all of you could answer. In fact, if you couldn't answer that question, you probably wouldn't be in class today. So the Holocaust was the event where German soldiers and political leaders and bureaucrats and their non-German abettors planned and implemented the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and smaller numbers of Roma, Slavs, handicapped persons, homosexuals, and communists. Now, as such, the Holocaust remains the central event in all of German history. It is the central event in modern European history. It colors our understanding of what it means to be German and European. And it forces us to rethink events as pivotal and as distant as the European Enlightenment, that philosophic and political awakening that began in the middle of the 17th century. And during the Enlightenment, that long ago Enlightenment, philosophers and enlightened political leaders, such as Frederick the Great in Prussia and Catherine the Great in Russia, tried to apply rational scientific laws to the realm of politics. So the Enlightenment produced, among other things, the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789. But more important, it gave us the idea, which probably many of you subscribe to, the idea that human existence can be improved and even perfected through politics. And I think we saw a little bit of that improvement last Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. In fact, the Enlightenment tells us that history is the story of our improvement. But if I were to ask you why the Holocaust happened, I suspect you would find it much more difficult to answer. After all, why did hundreds of thousands of seemingly normal, intelligent, and otherwise moral Germans participate in mass murder? Why did millions of their countrymen do nothing to stop it? And as the historian Daniel Jonah Goldhagen pointed out more than 20 years ago, your answers would probably have as much to do with the nature of human existence, what Joseph Conrad called the heart of darkness, than with the individual motivations of persons who participated in murder. And I'm not so naive to think that I can answer this question. In fact, I'm fairly confident that if we could jump ahead in time 100 years to 2121, that wonderful palindrome of a number, 2121, 1212. No, that's not quite a palindrome. Students at SSU will still be debating this issue. But what I'm going to do today is provide you with a few conceptual tools and the historical background so you can begin to formulate an answer on your own to this question. Why? Why did the Holocaust happen? And so to do this, I'm going to identify three structural developments that in my mind facilitated the Holocaust, and then move on to the specific circumstances under which the Nazis came to power and how they went about persecuting Europe's Jews. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on ways historians have grappled with the Holocaust in recent decades. So let me go forward a slide. So I want to start with anti-Semitism. And here, I need to heed the injunction of a former speaker in this lecture series, Yehuda Bauer, who had a very long and illustrious career on faculty at Tel Aviv University and was really probably the leader, the sort of leading figure among Holocaust historians. And Yehuda Bauer pointed out that this is really a stupid term because it supposes that there's a doctrine of anti-Semitism to be opposed to. Of course, there is no doctrine of Semitism. And in its common usage, anti-Semitism refers to animosity towards Jews, but not, interestingly, toward other Semitic peoples, like Arabs. Now, in some forms, anti-Semitism is as old as Christianity itself. Many verses in the New Testament strike the modern reader as anti-Semitic. They probably reflect tensions in the early Christian movement between Jews who converted to Christianity and Jews who did not. But much of Christian anti-Semitism hinges on the idea that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. So according to the book of John, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Jerusalem, was ready to pardon Christ, but was convinced otherwise by a hostile Jewish crowd. According to the book of Matthew, Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, helped fabricate evidence against Christ, although a fuller reading of the passage suggests that Caiaphas wanted to stave off a Roman military response by sacrificing Christ. But as a result of this sort of scriptural basis for anti-Semitism, until the 20th century, it was accepted doctrine in the Roman Catholic Church that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. And this alone was often the cause of popular animosity toward Jews. So when the plague hit Europe in the middle of the 14th century, there were persistent rumors that it was caused by Jews who had poisoned the water. There were also rumors all across Europe, well into the 20th century, that Jews used the blood of Christian children in their Passover matzahs. Some of you probably don't know what a matzah is. It is a form of unleavened bread. Along with Muslims, Jews were targeted by the Crusades in the 11th through the 13th centuries. Jews were the objects of the Inquisition. And in the 12th and 13th centuries, Jews were repeatedly expelled from France. They were expelled from Spain in 1492. They were expelled from parts of Prussia, Prussia with a P, in the 1700s. And in the Russian Empire, where many displaced Jews settled, they were confined to residency in the Pale of Settlement, the map of which I have already shown you. In large parts of Eastern Europe, Jews were forbidden from owning land, and this gives us the most pernicious stereotype of Jewishness. Jews are merchants and money changers. Unexpected or unexplainable tragedies frequently resulted in pogroms. This is a Russian word. It refers to popular uprisings against Jews. It literally translates as a little storm. And so you can see that anti-Semitism has been with us for a very long time. I mean that anti-Semitism is unchanging. And in fact, over the course of the 19th century, anti-Semitism changed in fundamental ways. It became less religious and more racial in orientation. And this reflected a couple of really important developments. First, Jewish lives were increasingly urban. Jews assimilated. Many Jews were practicing. Men did not wear beards in yarmulke and taluses. And in the Russian Empire, movement in and out of the Pale of Settlement was tolerated. And then it's also the case that this switch from religious to racial anti-Semitism also reflected many pseudo-scientific theories that were in vogue in the 19th century, and that attributed defining physical and mental characteristics to ethnic and racial groups. And so we know, we've heard what these stereotypes are, even if we're reluctant to admit them. Englishmen are individualistic, Germans are punctual, Irishmen are drunkards. Jews were associated with less savory characteristics. They were greedy, they were rootless, and they were cosmopolitan. And this latter word, cosmopolitan, meant the same thing in the 19th century as it does now, but the values were reversed. Jews supposedly had very little loyalty for the nation, and instead were loyal to various transnational groups like the Jewish diaspora, or political movements like Zionism, that is the movement to create a Jewish homeland, or communism. And so you may have noticed that there's a contradiction here. How can you be a greedy communist? Aren't these things mutually exclusive? And this is what the sociologist at Brown University, Zygmunt Bauman, calls the viscosity of Jewish identity. Jewish identity as perceived by anti-Semites was always slippery. Jews could be arch capitalists, greedy in the extreme, or they could be conniving, atheistic Bolsheviks. And so this is hardly an exhaustive list of the indignities Jews have been subjected to over the last 2,000 years, and it's not meant to be an exhaustive list. But I do want to make a point that the historian Jan Gross makes in his study of the Holocaust in the Polish city of Jedwabne. Before the Holocaust, in Gross's view, anti-Semitism from the perspective of Jews was a lot like an intractable low-intensity war. Jews, particularly in Eastern Europe, had to be savvy to survive. So a moment's carelessness could lead to an insult that would result in a pogrom. But the point is that a low-intensity war is survivable. In all but a few extraordinary cases, the Holocaust was not. Okay, so that's my first sort of structural feature that I think facilitated the Holocaust. So let me move on now to the second. My apologies to Richard Wagner. So my second structural development feature here is, as you can see, nationalism. And the nationalism is a bit like totalitarianism. It's one of these words that is so overused, it's almost devoid of meaning, except that I have, I think, a very easy to remember definition for what nationalism is. Nationalism is the belief that every nation should have its own state. Nations are groups of people who typically imagine some sort of affinity that binds them together. And it's always an imagined affinity because nations are big enough that you can never ascertain that every other person actually has this affinity. But what the affinity is varies. It can be language, culture, religion, ethnicity, some combination of the above, or in the case of the American nation, creed. And despite what nationalists say, nationalists are very good at locating the origins of their nations in the distant past. Nations are actually relatively recent phenomena in human history. So even the oldest nations have existed for only about 200 years. And many of the nations in Eastern Europe are much younger than this. And in Western Europe, the signal event for early nationalists was the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was important because it located political sovereignty, that is the basis upon which one ruled, in a broad citizenry rather than in a narrow aristocracy or in a royal family. But in Central and Eastern Europe, here we are getting on to Wagner, where territories were incorporated into multinational empires or independent principalities, nationalism was shaped in important ways by a cultural movement called Romanticism. And in its broadest sense, Romanticism refers to a movement in art, in thought, in cultural sensibility, in which feeling and imagination are emphasized instead of science and rationality. And by the 1750s, the notion of historical progress, that the present was better than the past, was firmly entrenched in Europe. And the French and the American revolutions, insofar as they promised the emancipation of all men, and I guess the gendered word there is important and appropriate, the French and American revolutions marked the political culmination of this historical optimism. Now, Romanticism was a reaction to this growing confidence. In fact, we often use Romanticism interchangeably with the phrase counter-enlightenment. Romanticism expressed deep anxiety about the extent and pace of social and cultural change. Romanticism was skeptical of science. It was skeptical of the claim that man had mastered the secrets of nature. Romantics portrayed the sense of vulnerability and anxiety that beset modern man. And Romantic nationalists, like the German poet Johann Gottfried von Herder or the composer Richard Wagner, celebrated folk culture. And in folk culture, they saw something that had been constant throughout ages. In folk culture was the kernel of the authentic national self. And this national self had existed uncorrupted in folk culture for ages and ages. And if you know about Wagner's, say, Ring cycle of operas, I mean, this is all about, sort of developing some of the ideas that come out of German folk culture. And so, in other words, in view of the Romantics, the nation was unified because it shared in this cultural patrimony. And the irony here is that many of these Romantic nationalists, like Wagner, were often worldly and polyglot, meaning they spoke many different languages. Intellectuals, these are the epitome of the coffee house types. And they sit around in their coffee houses idolizing the lives of illiterate peasants. Now, as I'm in the way again, as a political doctrine, nationalism was and is one of the most successful of all time. So over the course of 100 years, Europe ceased to be a continent of empires, and it became instead a continent of nation states, states that based their legitimacy on the will of the nation. And so I'm going to go through a long list here, and I think it's less important that you take note of the countries on this list than you just see how many nation states come into existence over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. So Serbia is granted kind of partial autonomy in 1815, and then full autonomy at the end of the First World War in 1918. Greece, 1829. Romania, 1859. Italy, 1861. Germany, 1871. Bulgaria, 1878. Albania, 1912. Czechoslovakia, 1918. And Czechoslovakia admittedly is unique because it's a state of two nations, the Czechs and the Slovaks. And then we have a whole slew of countries that come into existence with Czechoslovakia at the end of the First World War. Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, Ukraine, all 1918. And then Turkey in 1923. But nationalism also caused problems. And the borders that were drawn between nation states, let me push myself up there, were rarely perfect. And so what this meant is that nation states were not homogeneous. So Romanians lived in Russia. Ukrainians lived in Poland. Germans lived in Czechoslovakia in the infamous Sudetenlands. Turks lived in Bulgaria. So millions of Europeans lived outside of their titular nation state. And then there were the Jews. The Jews had a nationalist ideology, Zionism, but they had no nation state, right? And so here, I'm going to go through a couple of slides here so you can see the sort of problems that Jewish populations cause in a world where politics are increasingly organized around the nation. And so here you see percentage of Jewish population, and I just want to call your attention here to Poland. Right, Poland, 8.6% of the Polish population, when we measure by ethnicity, was Jewish. Soviet Union, has the biggest population in real terms, 3 million, but only 1.8% of total population. In Romania, 725,000, 4% of the population. And then if we measure by religion, and this is, I think, if you compare these two numbers, you get a sense of just how many, Jews are assimilating. You get slightly different numbers. And this kind of gets at one of the peculiarities of Jewish identity, right? It's both an ethnic identity and it's a confessional identity. And then, Germans also lived outside of Germany proper. And of course, this was one of the things that really irked Hitler. And one of the things he tried to create in the 1930s, 1940s, was a greater Germany, a Germany that incorporated all ethnic Germans. And so you can see that the German populations outside of Germany are really quite substantial. And if there are perhaps some students here today who've taken Eastern European history with me, you know that many of these Germans migrated to other parts of Eastern Europe over the course of the 19th century. They were part of that non-indigenous middle class that these highly rigid Eastern European societies imported because they were unable to generate middle classes themselves. Okay, so that's my second structural feature that facilitated the Holocaust, the advent of nationalism. So my third and final feature, and here I'll be brief, was militarism. And this is also important. After 1870, every major European power maintained a standing army. It meant an army that existed even in peacetime. And European powers were spending increasing sums of money on weapons production. So military spending doubled in France between 1875 and 1914. During the same period, military spending tripled in Britain and Germany. And in Russia, by 1914, the military accounted for a full 1/3 of the total state budget. And so what this meant is that on the eve of World War I, there were some 19 million men and women already in uniform on the European continent. And military thinking and military values had begun to pervade European society. And then technology also spurred along the arms race. So the French introduced the machine gun in the 1860s. Too late, really, to have much effect on the American Civil War. New industrial processes made possible the development of far larger and more accurate pieces of artillery. And so by 1914, the Germans had artillery pieces that could launch shells 75 miles. And then iron bottoms revolutionized naval warfare. So by the early 1900s, a new vessel of unprecedented size, the dreadnought, or what we call the battleship, was being built in large numbers. And then even more ominously, nations began to experiment with chemical arms. But I think more important than even the size of the militaries or the technological advances was the cultural component of this all, is that the idea of violence became culturally acceptable. So Marxists on the left, social Darwinists on the right, liberals and racists, everyone thought that struggle between people was historically necessary and perhaps even beneficial. And so jingoism, which is a very bellicose form of patriotism, became the approved standard of national expression. So, and this enthusiasm for violence was manifested in exceedingly low rates of desertion. So in World War I, for instance, which was a completely senseless war if there ever was one, the French command anticipated that desertion rates would be between 5 and 13%. And obviously it wasn't terribly difficult for French soldiers to desert because they could often walk home. But in reality, French desertion rates proved to be somewhere in the vicinity of 1.5%. And this suggests that even among people who were fighting and dying, they had inculcated this or absorbed this view that what they were doing was beneficial. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears. That is out of order. So I'm going to switch gears here and move on to the Nazi rise to power. And Nazi success built upon the failures of German liberalism, in particular the failures of what was called the Weimar Republic. And Weimar was the city where the new German constitution was drafted after Germany's capitulation in World War I. And Weimar lasted until 1933. And during this period, 1918 to 1933, the Weimar Republic was arguably the world's most democratic state. Weimar also had many weaknesses. There were the weaknesses that are well known, like the fact that it was saddled with the reparations of the Treaty of Versailles. But equally important was extreme, even by present day American standards, political polarization between the left and the right. For instance, on November 9, 1918, the day German liberals proclaimed the formation of a republic modeled on Western democracies, Karl Liebknecht, who was a German socialist, proclaimed the formation of a pro-Soviet socialist republic. And then there were right-wing uprisings in 1920 and 1923 that capitalized on popular disenchantment with the economy. Now, in the summer of 1929, the American economy slipped into recession. In October, the New York Stock Exchange tanked. Europe collapsed within weeks of the American crisis. After the crash, American financiers were no longer able to continue infusing capital into European economies. And by 1932, American investment in Europe had fallen by 70% since 1929. And this was particularly rough for Germany, which depended on American loans to pay its war reparations. And so, not surprisingly, Germany was the first state to experience political upheaval. In parliamentary elections in September of 1930, German voters stunned the pundits by handing 107 seats in a 611-seat Reichstag parliament to the National Socialist Party. And overnight, the Nazis, as they were called, went from being an inconsequential party to comprising the second largest bloc of Reichstag. And so the Nazis appeared to be the prime beneficiaries in Germany of the mounting economic crisis. Now, of course, the Nazis were led by Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. As a young man, he dabbled as a painter, but was denied admission to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. He served with the German infantry in World War I and twice received the Iron Cross, which was the German equivalent of the Purple Heart, for surviving poison gas attacks. And after the war, Hitler joined the Nazi Party. And socialists here, in the Nazis is an acronym for National Socialists. And socialist here is not intended to be understood in the Marxist sense, but rather it was a reflection of the feeling of solidarity that supposedly existed among German veterans of the First World War, German veterans who had been betrayed by the home front. In 1923, Hitler was arrested for participating in a coup against the Bavarian government in Munich. The coup plotters were caught before any damage could be done, and Hitler was sentenced to 9 months in prison. And while in prison, Hitler wrote the book that would become the Bible of the Nazi movement, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out his view of history. And he was very much writing kind of a polemic against Marx. And of course, Marx saw history as the product of class struggle. Hitler claimed instead that history was driven along by struggle between the races. There was a master race in Hitler's view, the Aryans. The Aryans were the predecessors, the distant ancestors of the Germans and the Brits. I guess we would call them the Anglo-Saxons. And they were ordained by God to be the implacable foe of lesser races, particularly Jews and Slavs. And according to Hitler, Germany had to adopt an aggressive foreign policy in order to achieve its historical destiny. And he thought that the German army had to conquer essential Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe. And this expansion would anger France, Germany's traditional enemy to the west. But Hitler thought Britain would never intervene to stop it, because of course, the Brits and the Germans shared this ancestor. And so these were the core elements of Nazi policy: racial superiority on one hand, and the need for expansion on the other. Now, let me find the correct slide here. Okay, so Hitler came to power almost by accident. So despite the impressive showing of the Nazis in the 1930 elections, they still played second fiddle to the largest party in the country, the Social Democrats, or center-left party. By 1932, the Nazis had become the strongest party in the Reichstag in numeric terms, but it was still far from a majority. The Nazis controlled 230 of the 611 seats in parliament. And moreover, there's some evidence that in late 1932 and 1933, that the Nazis were actually losing some electoral support to their arch rival on the left, the communists. And the communists were polling a distant third behind the Nazis and the Social Democrats, but they were gaining rapidly. And so, a lot of smart pundits were saying at the end of 1932 that the Nazi phenomenon was waning. But ironically, the Nazi seizure of power can be attributed, at least in part, to the commitment among Social Democrats to the creation of a liberal bourgeois democracy. And so the German chancellor tried to convince the German president, Paul von Hindenburg, who was a hero of the First World War, to ban both the Nazi and the Communist parties at the end of 1932. But Hindenburg refused, and he refused because he saw it as a violation of the freedoms that were enshrined in the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, like the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly. But clearly something had to be done to constrain the Nazis. And the solution seemed ingenious at the time, but in retrospect, it stands as one of the great historical fuck-ups of all time. Hindenburg offered Hitler the chancellorship in January 1933. And as chancellor, Hitler would rule over a coalition cabinet which contained only 3 Nazis among its 11 seats. And so in the eyes of Hindenburg and many other very smart people, once Hitler was in power, he would have to tone down his rhetoric and act more responsibly. And some people even thought that Hitler would be little more than a puppet who could easily be controlled by the mainstream political parties. But once Hitler was in power, he moved very rapidly to consolidate his position. As was his right as chancellor, he demanded that new elections to the Reichstag be held in early March 1933. But on February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building burned down. And we know now in retrospect that the fire was probably set by a Nazi arsonist, but Hitler blamed the communists. And by noon of the following day, some 4,000 communists had been arrested. And Paul von Hindenburg signed an emergency decree which suspended individual liberties. And in the ensuing days, Nazi thugs terrorized their political opponents in the streets of Berlin and the other big cities of Germany. And so this set the stage for a Nazi electoral triumph on March 5th, 1933, the Nazis won 44% of the vote. But the Nazis had allies in the so-called Nationalist Party, and so Hitler could claim that a majority of seats in the Reichstag were loyal to him. Less than 3 weeks later, at the end of March, the Reichstag approved the so-called Enabling Act, which authorized the government to rule by decree for 4 years. In a sense, what the Reichstag was doing was decreeing itself out of existence. So Hitler had become a dictator, even though a majority of the German population had not voted for his party. Now, 2 factors made the Nazi expansion in 1933 so rapid. Now, first, the Nazis relied on the work of the Gestapo, later the SS, the secret police. And secondly, thousands of bureaucrats and state officials joined the Nazi Party because they thought it was beneficial for their careers. Now I have to go back a slide. Now, the traditional institution that might have given Hitler trouble was the army. And we know that the officer corps in particular in the German army had little respect for the new chancellor. But of course, military support was essential for Hitler's aggressive foreign policy. And so to eliminate any potential opposition within the military, Hitler accused several prominent army generals of homosexuality, and he ordered the SS to assassinate them on June 30, 1934, in what became known as Night of the Long Knives. When Paul von Hindenburg died of natural causes 5 weeks later, at the beginning of August 1934, Hitler combined the offices of Chancellor and President. Now, effective opposition to the Nazis might also have come from the Christian churches. We know that the Nazi electoral triumph in 1933 was made possible by support from Protestant bourgeois voters. Bourgeois here means middle class. So that was the typical person who voted for the Nazis. They were Protestant and they were middle class. Nonetheless, most Protestant clergymen tried to remain politically neutral. And a very small minority of Protestant clergymen organized an active resistance that denounced Nazi racism and totalitarianism, including this man you see here on the screen in front of you, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who dies in the camps in 1945. And in the post-war decades, Bonhoeffer is elevated as the German moral hero par excellence of the World War II period, because he did resist. And we know overall some 800 Protestant clergymen died in the concentration camps for resisting the Nazis. Now, effective opposition might also have come from the Roman Catholic Church. In 1933, Hitler signed a treaty with the Vatican in which Pope Pius XI gave his stamp of approval to Nazism in return for a promise that the Nazi government would recognize the traditional confessional liberties of the Roman Catholic Church in Germany. And these were the Roman Catholic Church would not be persecuted in a majority Protestant country. This is what Hitler promised. Now, unfortunately, the pact undermined the ability of the Catholic Center Party, the party that most Catholics supported in elections, to oppose the government of Hitler. And besides, Hitler's assurances to the papacy proved to be worthless. In the mid-1930s, the Nazis ruthlessly attacked Catholic schools and Catholic youth groups. And by the time Pope Pius XI decided that the 1933 treaty had been a mistake, which he did in a 1937 encyclical called With Burning Sorrow, Nazism was firmly entrenched. In this encyclical in 1937, Pope Pius attacked so-called totalitarianism. He was much more hesitant to attack Nazi anti-Semitism. And so at best, Pope Pius turned a blind eye on the suffering of millions and millions of European Jews. At worst, he actively abetted the Holocaust by sanctioning anti-Semitism among Catholics. Now, Nazi racism, of course, was directed primarily against Jews. In 1933, after coming to power, Hitler expelled most Jews from state administrative positions. 2 years later, he issued the infamous Nuremberg laws, which denied German citizenship to persons with 2 or more Jewish grandparents. So that becomes the official legal definition of Jewishness, 2 or more Jewish grandparents. The Nuremberg laws prohibited marriage and sexual intercourse between Germans and Jews, and it required Jews to wear a yellow Star of David in public. German towns could refuse residency to Jews, and German businesses were forced to fire their Jewish employees. Now, by 1938, more than 100,000 Jews had fled abroad. Those that remained were subjected to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And you see here that the dates here are significant because it roughly corresponds with the 20th anniversary of the end of the First World War, right? Armistice Day was November 11th. And remember the sort of picture that Hitler is painting of the First World War is that the heroic German military was betrayed by the home front, particularly by Jews on the home front. And so on this night of broken glass, scores of Jews were killed, thousands were dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets, 200 synagogues were burned, 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Paradoxically, Hitler's government blamed German Jews for the disturbances, and 25,000 Jews were incarcerated as a result of the unrest of Kristallnacht. Now, these early attacks on Jews were part of what we can call the disemancipation phase of Nazi policy. That is the phase where Jews were stripped of the rights of citizenship. What made the Nazi program so unique was their subsequent attempt to annihilate European Jews through methodical genocide. Hitler wanted Lebensraum, living space in the East. And according to Heinrich Himmler, this would require the annihilation of up to 30 million Slavs, whom the Nazis also regarded as subhuman. And to this end, Himmler authorized so-called SS action teams, Einsatzgruppen, to slaughter at will in the Soviet Union. And these special action groups typically followed the advancing front lines and rounded up Jews and communists. These units typically forced their victims, many of whom were Jews, to dig mass graves and then line up on the rim of the graves to be shot. Millions of Soviet citizens died in this manner. Some 3.7 million Soviet prisoners of war were also executed at Himmler's orders. And then even lower than the Slavs in the Nazi racial hierarchy were the Jews. Hitler was determined to eradicate as many of the 11 million Jews who lived in Europe as possible. And so soon after the outbreak of war in 1939, Jews in Poland were herded into ghettos, first in the city of Łódź in Poland, and then in Warsaw and elsewhere. And it was from the ghettos that many Jews were sent to be killed in concentration camps. But the death rate within the ghettos was already 20% per year by 1942. And these ghettos were meant to be a temporary expedient to isolate Jews from the rest of the human community while their ultimate fate was determined. In July 1941, Hermann Göring, at Hitler's command, issued the fateful order for the mass murder of Jews. In the order, it was phrased as, quote, a total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. And actually in the Nuremberg trials and in the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in the early 1960s, the attorneys drew attention to the fact that the Nazis often spoke euphemistically about murder, because you tend to speak euphemistically about things that you know are wrong. The following January 1942, Nazi leaders met in a Berlin suburb, Wannsee, to map out plans to deport Jews to camps specially equipped to exterminate large numbers in an efficient manner. And execution by machine guns was deemed too slow and costly. The preferred method was the gas chamber, after which dental fillings could be removed before the corpses were burned in crematoria and the bones and ashes used for fertilizer. Some corpses were boiled to produce soap. The most notorious of these camps was at Auschwitz in Poland. Auschwitz was a model of German efficiency. It was capable of killing up to 12,000 persons per day. By the end of the war, Auschwitz alone was responsible for the murder of 2.5 million persons in gas chambers and 500,000 more by barbaric treatment. The Nazi plan to exterminate inferior people also included gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and the mentally ill. Between 1938 and 1941, the Nazis perfected their gassing technique on 70,000 mentally ill Germans. German scientists perfected a form of cyanide known as Zyklon B, but even at most efficient, gassing took between 15 and 20 minutes to kill most of its victims. Now, at first, Allied and Jewish leaders were incredulous at the reports of genocide. But even when these reports were confirmed, no effort was made to bomb either the camps or the rail lines leading to the camps. Although underground church groups, mainly Protestant ones, assisted the Jews, Pope Pius XI and his successor, Pope Pius XII, never directly condemned the atrocities, even when Jews were herded into cattle cars in Rome itself for deportation to the death camps. There was scant sympathy for Jews in Poland, especially among a Roman Catholic clergy that was bitterly anti-Semitic. There were instances of heroism. The Danes, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, and the Italians organized large underground resistance networks that saved tens of thousands of Jews from murder. But efforts to blame the slaughter on a mere handful of deranged Nazi leaders are truly indefensible. Approximately 50,000 people were directly involved in Hitler's final solution. They were German soldiers and German politicians and French collaborationists and Polish Roman Catholic clergy. Few of these people were ever held accountable for their crimes. Okay. So I want to conclude here. Let me check the time. Okay, I'm doing well. I want to conclude here by talking a little bit about how historians have tried to make sense of the Holocaust. And so here I'm going to shift from the who, what, where, when, right, that I've been talking about so far, to the realm of interpretation, the why and the how. And for several decades after 1945, debate on the Holocaust centered on two schools of thought. And these schools of thought have very unsexy names. They were called the intentionalists and the functionalists. And these were actually terms that weren't coined until the 1980s. They were coined to describe several decades of scholarship since 1945 about the Holocaust. In fact, really the key figure here and kind of making sense of this all on the meta level was a British historian of the Holocaust named Tim Mason, I think was his name. And Mason was a prominent critic of the intentionalist line of thinking about the Holocaust. So let me describe to you what these schools of thought are. So the intentionalists argued that the Holocaust was the product of Nazi willfulness. So in other words, if you wanted to study the roots of the Holocaust, you would look in the origins of the Nazi Party. You would look in Hitler's Mein Kampf. You would read the Nuremberg laws. In other words, the Nazis had a master plan to destroy the Jews from day one, and they acted on it. And prominent intentionalists include a historian I've already mentioned, Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, but also Marius Hilgruber and Karl Dietrich Brocker. Now, opposed to the intentionalists are the so-called functionalists. And the functionalists argue that there was no master plan from day one, even though they recognized the deep anti-Semitism of Nazi leaders. The functionalists argue that the Holocaust was the product of a specific confluence of events. And they tend to emphasize rivalries within the bureaucracy and historical exigency rather than the ambitions or longstanding plans of political leaders. You know, I think last year when I spoke, I was followed by one of the most prominent American functionalists, Christopher Browning, now retired from the University of North Carolina. Browning was a speaker in the lecture series. And Browning has argued that Hitler's decision to undertake mass genocide occurred rather late in the game, not until late summer and early fall of 1941. And in other words, genocide, the Holocaust, was part of the general euphoria of German victories in the initial months after the invasion of the Soviet Union. And supporters of the functionalist school point out that German liquidation efforts were highly limited prior to summer and fall of 1941. For instance, in July of 1941, Heydrich ordered the Einsatzgruppen to kill immediately only Jews in leading state and party positions, far different from the policies that the Nazis embraced at Wannsee in January 1942. And I think you can see here that the functionalist view of the Holocaust is more nuanced and ambiguous. The events preceding mass genocide produced their own momentum. And as the German historian Martin Brosat has argued, they pushed the Nazis into a blind alley where improvisation became far more common than adherence to plan. And historians, I think just by nature, tend to be naturally skeptical of any one-size-fits-all argument. Historians are reluctant to reduce complex events to simple cause-effect relationships. And for this reason, functionalism has proven to be a far more fertile line of thinking about the Holocaust than intentionalism. And so functionalism, for instance, claims a far greater number of proponents. Now, scholarship on the Holocaust has since really the 1980s has moved in a couple of different directions. And in the late 1980s, the Holocaust became a prominent issue in West German intellectual life in the so-called Historikerstreit. the historian's argument. And at issue in this Historikerstreit was the distinctiveness of the Holocaust. Is it possible or even appropriate to draw comparisons between the Holocaust and other episodes of mass killing? And I want to point out here, this is something which this lecture series does very explicitly. Were Germans also the targets of genocidal actions in the purposeful firebombing of residential quarters in Hamburg and Dresden, and the ethnic cleansing of German Silesia in Eastern Prussia at the end of the war? And if the Holocaust was not such an extraordinary event, meaning highly distinctive, should subsequent generations of Germans feel guilt for it? And then in the 1990s, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman at Brown University placed the Holocaust within broader trajectories of modernization. Bauman argued that the Holocaust was the perverse outcome of an underlying characteristic of modern governance, namely the tendency of modern states to cultivate parts of their population seen as beneficial and to weed parts of their populations that are seen as detrimental. And in Bauman's view, all modern states engage in these activities. They weed and cultivate through social programs and criminal law and tax code and immigration policies. In Nazi Germany, weeding took the perverse form of genocide, but it was not so different in Bauman's view in its underlying rationale than more benign forms of weeding. And so you can perhaps see that Bauman places great importance on the spirit of the Enlightenment. If we accept the Enlightenment's premise that human existence can be perfected, what are we willing to do to achieve that perfection? And then conversely, the historian Jan Gross has argued that any straightforward causal relationship between modernity and the Holocaust is bound to obscure the highly diverse and contextually specific ways that the Holocaust played out. And the object of Gross's study was the village of Jedwabne in the formerly Soviet zone of occupation in Eastern Poland. And Gross has shown that atavistic hatred also motivated killing. Poles killed their Jewish neighbors because of age-old bias, because of resentment. They used hoes and shovels, not guns and gas chambers. And interestingly, well, the killings in Jedwabne would not have occurred had German soldiers not been present. The Germans themselves played little role in the atrocities. In fact, some Jews in Jedwabne escaped the killings by sheltering with German soldiers. And so in Gross's formulation, the act of killing produced a demoralization of Jedwabne's Poles. And here he uses demoralization in its literal meaning, meaning it's stripping people of their morality. And so for this reason, many of the perpetrators of the Holocaust in Jedwabne became staunch supporters of Polish-style Stalinism after the Red Army returned in 1944. And this is 100% contrary to the way historians have normally couched politics in Eastern Europe. We have typically seen Nazism and Stalinism as two extremes with an ocean between them. But Gross argues that in fact, many of the people who were complicit in the crimes of Nazism become in the post-war years supporters of Polish-style Stalinism because of this process of demoralization that the killings entailed. Okay, So that's it for my lecture. I'm going to take myself off share. And let me close down stuff here. And let me unpin, remove pin. Okay. So I don't know how we're going to do this with 123 people here, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
I hope some of you have questions for Steve. He certainly gave a very stimulating and informative lecture. If you do, please submit them in the form of a question and answer on your computer, and I in turn will ask them of our speaker. So any of you who have a question, please send them in now.
While we're waiting on that, can we give him a little round of applause and maybe ask the students or participants to put up their applause icons for him?
Thank you.
That was great. That was excellent. Thank you, Dr. Bittner.
That's quite an esteemed group you have behind you there, Cynthia. I see
Oh,
RBG and Dr.
yes.
King.
Yeah. Yeah, I figured both of those folks were not very controversial, so.
Yeah. Well, did you see after RBG died, did you see the New Yorker cover? It was just her lace, you know, the lace thing. It was really brilliant.
Steve, we have a question from someone in the audience who asks, does functionalist theory discuss the possibility that in order for the Holocaust to happen, the Nazis needed to make small steps to their ultimate goal?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, you know, I think what the functionalists argue is that this is much more ad hoc than the intentionalists typically portray it. You know, it's you know, the decision to engage in mass genocide is taken rather late in the game. It's part of the euphoria of German victories over the Red Army in 1941. In that, you know, obviously, the functionalists are not denying, you know, deep Nazi anti-Semitism and all these sort of, you know, the build-up to genocide that I have detailed for you here. You know, the persecution of potential opposition, the Nuremberg laws, Kristallnacht. I mean, they don't deny the significance of all of that. But nonetheless, they draw a qualitative distinction between the level of persecution and killing, you know, before late 1941 and after 1941. You know, and interestingly, I think the functionalist view is really comes out of some of the testimony, like in the Eichmann trial, you know, where Eichmann, he didn't even consider himself, interestingly, to be anti-Semitic. Like he couched himself as friend of Jew. You know, he discussed in the 1930s trying to create a Jewish homeland in Madagascar. But you know, he engaged in genocide because he wanted to please his superiors. And so those sorts of bureaucratic rivalries figure very prominently in the functionalist view. And again, you'll notice here that, you know, when I've been describing, you know, how historians have made sense of the Holocaust, I've eluded a non-scholarly view of the Holocaust, that is denialism. You know, no one I have mentioned is engaged in denialism. But that doesn't mean there isn't dispute among historians about why this occurred.
Another student asks, I have always struggled to understand how Jewish people carry the ethnic identity even when they do not practice Judaism. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, you have to go to Israel. Because Israel is all ethnic and hardly any practicing Jews. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the, you know, the peculiarities of Jewish identity, and it didn't always used to be this way. If you, in medieval Europe, there were various ethnic groups in Eastern Europe, particularly in southern Ukraine, that were non-Jews by ethnicity, but they practiced Judaism. And I have in mind here the so-called Khazars. a group that was probably assimilated by the surrounding Turkic-speaking communities. But for whatever reason, since the so-called Middle Ages, Jewish confessional identity and Jewish ethnic identity have largely overlapped. And in fact, in the Soviet Union, where everybody was given a passport which had their ethnic identity indicated in the internal passport, Jewishness was a possibility. Like that could be listed in the Soviet Union as your ethnic identity. And it's strange. I know of people who aren't Jewish. I mean, Roman Catholics don't consider themselves to be an ethnicity. And Protestants, Methodists are not an ethnicity. But this is kind of one of the peculiarities of Jewish identity, that there's a large degree of overlap between the ethnic and the confessional.
Yes. Someone would like to know that with regard to the photo of the Einsatzgruppen in Poland, was that inside Poland or was it in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest, where that photo was taken, but the Einsatzgruppen were fairly active up until the successful defense of Moscow in the fall of 1941. This was a period from June, from the invasion in June until the defense of Moscow. The Red Army was in retreat, and it's not until Moscow is successfully defended that the Germans are forced to withdraw a little bit, and that kind of brings to an end some of the activities of the Einsatzgruppen. But they also realize just how inefficient that form of killing was. And then what occurs after that tends to be far more systematic, because it occurs in the wake of the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where they decide on using gas chambers. But still, a huge number of Soviet Jews die at the hands of the Einsatzgruppen.
Yes, they did. In 1930s Germany, in your opinion, what was the point of no return when it came to preventing the Holocaust?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is, this would be the sort of thing that historians argue about ad nauseum. Was the point of no return February of 1933 when Hitler is brought into the cabinet? Was it the Enabling Act when the parliament basically legislates itself out of existence? I don't know, to be honest. I suspect it's, one wonders if, if people like, people like Christopher Browning, who placed great emphasis on the euphoria surrounding the initial invasion in June, and the shift towards methodical genocide grows out of this euphoria. One wonders, what might have gone differently if the Red Army was a little bit better prepared in those early months of the war. Would the Holocaust have proceeded in the same manner if there had been a successful defense of Eastern Poland? But there wasn't a successful defense. I mean, the Red Army was completely overwhelmed. And it wasn't really until Stalingrad at the end of 42 and the beginning of 43 that the tide had been turned.
Many people claim that being anti-Zionist is a form of anti-Semitism. As a historian, how would you respond to this?
Well, I would say that there's a clear difference between Zionism and anti-Semitism. I mean, Zionism is a nationalist ideology. And, as a nationalist ideology, I can think of it in value neutral terms. I mean, it's very much the equivalent of German nationalism or Bulgarian nationalism. I mean, it reflects the historically specific context in which it originated, which was 19th century Europe. But that said, I don't think that one is, that criticism of the state of Israel makes one an anti-Semite. In fact, many American Jews are very critical of the government of Bibi Netanyahu and Israeli actions in the occupied territories. So I would resist any conflation of, being an of Zionism and anti-Semitism, or anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I think we need to recognize the historical context in which Zionism originated.
Another viewer asks, I think the Holocaust showcases the significance of contingency in history. So why do you think people view the Holocaust and even genocide as something that is far beyond our modern ideas of progress? What can the Holocaust teach us today about major historical events such as genocide?
Yeah, so I'm trying to follow along here in the chat. Which? What's the name there on the question?
Kevin Kosmatka.
Okay, I think I've had Kevin in class.
Wow.
Yeah, okay, so Kevin, by sort of emphasizing contingency, you've clearly identified yourself as a proponent of the functionalist school. Your question then, so why do you think people view the Holocaust and even genocide as something that is far beyond our modern ideas of progress? That I would take issue with that. I think what's so provocative about Bauman's view of the Holocaust is he sees it as kind of an intensification of the things that make us modern, sort of a perverse intensification. Like, let's think about, why the Holocaust, the characteristics of the Holocaust. The means of killing were mechanized. It was motivated by a modern ideology, nationalism. It was carried out by a modern bureaucratic state, right? And so the Holocaust was modern through and through. And I think we delude ourselves if we say that this was a betrayal of what makes us modern. It was the perverse manifestation of what makes us modern. And that's what's frightening about it. Right, is that we can look at some of the underlying ideas, that motivated the killings. The idea of modern states engaged in gardening, they cultivate and they weed, and we can see those same things in Washington, D.C., but in far more benevolent form, right? But it suggests that there isn't that great, there isn't a chasm dividing modern democratic states from genocidal states. And I think that's what makes it frightening. And that's what makes it really important for us to talk about.
Another student asks, that his question goes back to the topic of the cattle cars and herding Jews in the trains to the concentration camps. You stated that Pius the 11th and 12th never condemned the atrocity and even let Jews be taken on trains from Rome. You said that there was no effort to bomb the rail lines or camps. Why wasn't there an effort to stop the trains, or at least stop the method of the mass genocide? Out of all the skirmishes in World War II, why wasn't there a huge effort to dismantle the cattle car shipping away of Jews?
Yeah, so, this is a question that I know has been asked before after prior lectures in this lecture series that I've given. And let me say that I recognize that the moral calculus of bombing the camps is very difficult, right? Certainly if there had been a decision, say in 1944, that Auschwitz is going to be bombed, a lot of Jews are going to die. There's just no way around that. And so I recognize that that's significant. Why were the rail lines never bombed? That's a tougher question. And it's not the case, by 1942-43, there was knowledge of, what was happening, both within the Soviet Union and among the Western Allies. but it wasn't seen as, you know, for whatever reason, it wasn't seen as critical to put an end to it. And I don't know why that is. You know, certainly it represents kind of a moral failing among the Allies. You know, particularly after the Battle of Stalingrad, when it really becomes clear that the Allies are going to win. You know, and even, you know, students who were with me last semester and took the Soviet Union in World War II, I mean, we know, you know, there's a lot of firsthand accounts of, you know, German officers saying, you know, in the wake of Stalingrad, we're screwed. We're not going to win the war. And certainly the Allies saw that as well. And it was really just a matter of time. And so why, if the war has shifted in your favor, why not try to minimize the number of casualties, of Jewish casualties in the Holocaust? And I don't know the answer to that. You know, it's probably a product of many different things. It's certainly not the case that, you know, the Allies were philo-Semitic. You know, and I don't know if Myrna's out there today, but
No, not today.
not today. Well, you know, there was a very sort of tragically fated boat full of Jewish children, the Kinder Transport. They're turned away from American port because you know, Americans didn't want these Jews, you know, to come ashore. But I suspect that that's probably not, you know, the only reason why this decision wasn't made. It was just one contributing factor.
Does history show other politicians and government officials sharing the same ideology as Hitler prior to his uprising?
Okay, can you whose question is that?
Anonymous.
Anonymous. Let me see if I can find it.
It's toward the end.
Does history show other politics government? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to assume you're talking about Germany. And here again, I want to point out that I'm an outsider, but I do know that for a very long time, one of the, you know, the big questions of debate in German history was over the so-called Sonderweg, the special path of German, you know, of German modernization. And what proponents of the Sonderweg often did is they said that you know, the Holocaust was somehow the product of Germany's warped road to modernity. So Germany was kind of a second round industrial power, right? I mean, it came later. And when Germany industrialized, it remained highly autocratic. You know, it was never really fully democratic until Weimar, this kind of tragically, you know, short experiment with democracy. Germany had relatively small and emasculated middle classes compared to Great Britain, the United States, France. And so, you know, some historians have said that, you know, this is when we look deep into the German past for the reasons of the Holocaust, we have to look at the so-called Sonderweg. Now, whether, you know, does that mean that Germans were more likely to be anti-Semitic? You know, I don't know. You know, there were certainly, you know, very prominent German anti-Semites in the 19th century, including Richard Wagner. But I don't think that, you know, again, I think we have to draw a qualitative distinction here between being anti-Semitic and being complicit in genocide.
Your colleague Peter Hayes says that if you were to ask the question of Europeans 20 years before the Holocaust, who would be likely to murder 6 million Jews, the answer would be the French or the Russians.
Yeah, well, the Russians had quite a long history of treating the Jews very poorly. So,
okay. During the Nazi era, are jobs limited or being limited to Jews back then due to their identity? And how does that affect the economy in general?
Well, this was, for a lot of non-Jews, this was kind of a boon. In fact, I have a graduate student right now at Sonoma State who's writing on the so-called Gurlitt trove of art. And Gurlitt was an art dealer in Munich who bought art from Jews under distress. And he had been granted a special dispensation by the Nazi government to do this. And so for Gurlitt, this was very profitable. For the descendants of many of these Jews who perished in the Holocaust, the question remains, was this a fair transaction? That's what my student is writing about, is the politics of restitution. So a lot of people in Germany, there was a sort of carnivalesque atmosphere to anti-Semitism. It was a way to enrich yourself through means that previously would have been deemed completely inappropriate or immoral.
Another student says, I'm interested in parallels to today. 1 million Uyghurs are in camps in China. There is no major effort to stop this other than weak protests from Western countries. In your opinion, what would it take to stop China's efforts, or in other places such as Tibet?
Yeah, here I really have to claim that this is way beyond my expertise, but we've become so inextricably linked with the American and Chinese economies, have become so inextricably linked. It's like a mutual suicide embrace that we have with the Chinese. They're the largest investor now in America, largest foreign investor in American T-bills. And so, it's difficult for us to, to take a stand without also hurting ourselves. And I don't know what the answer is. I suspect in the long run, I think the answer is to seek consensus with the Chinese, to try to get them to play by, the accepted rules of the international arena, to value human rights. But that's obviously, we're making a moral argument to them, and they might not see it in their interest to go along with us. But I don't really know what the option is to that. There are various targeted sanctions. And I was reading in the New Yorker a couple weeks ago that it's possible now to genetically identify where certain textiles originate. And so American clothing manufacturers are testing a lot of materials that emanate from China to make sure they're not coming from Western China, the region around the Uyghurs. And those are all small steps, though. I suspect in the long run, the only answer to this is to try to get Chinese citizens to demand better of their government.
You mentioned that Hitler believed that Britain would not want to go to war with Germany because he favored their ancestry. Did this play a role in how long it took for Britain to declare war on Germany?
Well, the war begins on September 1st, right? The war in Europe begins on September 1st when the Wehrmacht invades the western half of Poland. And then 17 days later, the Soviet Red Army occupies the eastern half of Poland. And that's the event that brings Britain and France into the war. But what's interesting, I think, what I was trying to point out there is, Hitler placed great importance on racial identity, and he wrongly thought that the British would never intervene because of this supposed shared ancestry. And obviously there were some, this didn't figure so prominently in the Second World War, but in the First World War, there are real family linkages between Kaiser Wilhelm and Queen Victoria. Victoria was Wilhelm's grandmother. and so I think in that regard, Hitler actually, he made the wrong wager, because Britain did intervene in the end.
Does it seem that the generalizations of intentionalism are great enough to proactively overlook modern conditions which would be seriously troubling to a functionalist?
Where is that? So that's Josh Emery.
Mhm.
Does it seem that generalizations of intentionalism? So I'm not sure I understand the question here. So Josh, can you explicate a bit more in
Yeah.
the
Try-
chat? I got to say, you get a lot more questions in this format
Exactly.
than when
I
you're
was thinking the same thing. No, this is
speaking
good.
live in an auditorium.
That's right.
Uh,
Okay. Were other points of wartime interest targeted by Allied forces within German borders instead of the death camps?
so where's that question?
Up by the top.
Up by the top. Okay,
Yeah,
let me
another
see.
anonymous attendee.
Anonymous. Were other points of wartime interest targeted? Oh yeah. I mean, of course. There were lots of factories that were bombed. There were a lot of military installations that were bombed. By 1944, the Allies kind of figure out that, it's very hard to hit factories. It's much easier to burn an entire city down and in the process destroy a factory in the fires. And so this is really what happens to Hamburg. And to Dresden. Dresden most famously, but also parts of Frankfurt. Entire swaths of the city were destroyed in firebombing campaigns. And so there are targets of real military value that were being bombed. During the war. It's not the case that they weren't using those bombs on something else.
Yeah. Why were the people directly responsible for the final solution not punished?
Well, many of them were. There's these famous trials in Nuremberg after the war, where Soviet and American prosecutors, brought many of these people up on charges, and many of these, the principal architects of Holocaust were eventually executed. But why wasn't, we're talking here, about hundreds of people being held responsible when there were thousands and thousands of people who were complicit in this. And why weren't the other people, held responsible? And some of it was self-interest. The Americans in particular were very keen in the context of 1945 to spirit out of Germany people who might be helpful to the United States as the Cold War was beginning to unfold. And so lots of German scientists who had blood on their hands were brought to the United States. They were not held responsible. And then there's just sort of a chaos. Europe was in ruins in 1945. To walk around without an identity card would not have been unusual at all. And so in the chaos, there were opportunities to escape, to claim new identities. And so lots of people, staked out new lives in the United States or in Argentina, or even in Europe, claiming to be somebody they were not because they knew they would be held responsible if their true identity was discovered. And then, I think a more interesting question, it's a question that I asked students in my 20th century history class in conjunction with the Rwandan genocide, is genocide such a monumental crime that it sort of belies efforts to find justice, right? Is it ever really possible to seek justice for a crime as big as genocide. And this is something that humans have struggled with, not only in the context of the Holocaust, but in case of genocides elsewhere. It seems like we're very good at getting a few people.
Yeah.
We're not very good at getting everybody.
It seems African Americans weren't perceived as low as Jews and Slavs were. Why is that, considering they were deemed an inferior race?
Okay, so here I can refer you to some new scholarship. There's a couple of historians who have looked at the extent to which the United States was inspirational to Nazi Germany. And if you think about it, when the Germans looked at the United States, they saw a settler colonial society, right? I mean, we had colonized a nation, and then we had organized this nation on the basis of a racial hierarchy, right? So at the top were white people. And then there were various groups below whites, the indigenous people, blacks, the descendants of slaves. And so that, the Nazis obviously were aware of, the depths of American racism, and found inspiration in that. In fact, Germany was not really much of an imperial power in its own right. We call the Nazi period the Third Reich. Well, the Second Reich was the so-called Kaiser Reich. It's the sort of very late in the game German empire that existed at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, a handful of possessions in Africa. And again, the Germans were very keen to kind of model their empire on the American example, this sort of settler colonialism in a clear racial hierarchy. Why, if African American soldiers, insofar as they were, captured in Europe, as far as I know, they were not subject to murder. This was not true of Jewish soldiers. So an American Jewish soldier who was captured in Europe would have been killed by virtue of being Jewish.
This is broad, but perhaps you can shed some enlightenment. Why do people deny the Holocaust when there is so much evidence that proves it happened?
I don't know. I mean, it's, you're asking me, why are people illogical? I don't know. I mean, I suspect that, it seems like, anti-Semitism in the United States takes two manifestations in regard to the Holocaust. There's the "it didn't happen" manifestation. It's all this sort of attempt to tarnish, Nazi Germany. Or it's the manifestation we saw 3 weeks ago on the steps of the Capitol building, where you had people wearing sweatshirts with the words WW, no, what was it? 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough. And so it's this, and so the other sort of extreme of this sort of a form of anti-Semitism is the Holocaust didn't go far enough. So it seems like the anti-Semites, they either deny the Holocaust because it tarnishes the Nazis, or they say the Nazis didn't go far enough. But why, why denialism exists, I don't know. I suspect that a lot of people who are deniers, they think they're being very sophisticated, that they're privy to some knowledge that the rest of us don't have, but they're really not. It's a sign of their own prejudice and small-mindedness.
That's right. In the time of the Weimar Republic, political polarization and economic woes were very apparent and a cause of conflict. But what was the main cause for the rise of the National Socialist Party when many knew of their insidious ideals?
Yeah, well, So here, I mean, I think I have to speak a little bit about the unusual circumstances in which the First World War ended. You know, I said in my lecture that if there ever was a senseless war, it was the First World War. The First World War was fought over no great idea. Um, you know, I think that perhaps the best evidence of the the senselessness of the First World War is that in the years leading up to the war, when the various alliances were being created, the British actually reached out first to the Germans, like, can we be part of your alliance? And the Germans said yes. And then the British said, well, if we're gonna be part of your alliance, we don't want you to build a deep water navy. And then the Germans said no. So this suggests that there was no great idea that divided the belligerents in the First World War. Woodrow Wilson said they were, fighting to make the world safe for democracy, but that was kind of a patina that was added to the First World War after the fact, kind of late in the game. And then the First World War ends under very peculiar circumstances. Russia withdrew from the war formally in March of 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And this makes the First World War a one-front war for Germany. And indeed, in April, the German advance begins. The lines are finally broken. The trenches are crossed, and the German army marches, to within, a couple dozen kilometers from Paris. And at the very last moment, the Americans show up. It had taken the Americans a full year to mobilize and to get troops into Europe. And the advance is halted. And then in this context, the German home front rebels. It's just like this act of utter frustration that, how can this war go on any longer? And so German workers go out in the streets, people go out on strike. And in this context, Paul von Hindenburg, who becomes German president, basically demands that the Kaiser seek peace. And so Germany does not think of itself as being defeated in the First World War. But of course it was treated as a defeated party by the Western Allies against the advice, I should point out, of Woodrow Wilson. It was David Lloyd George and Clemenceau, the French president, who were keen to punish Germany. And so this and then there develops this myth of the home front betrayal. And who's on the home front? The Jews, who were too cowardly, as the racist mythology went, to actually fight in the trenches on behalf of the Kaiserreich. And of course, that's not true. I mean, lots of Jews served heroically in the First World War on behalf of Germany. But that's how they, the Nazis propagated this idea of betrayal, the home front betrayal.
Finally, a student asks, why did the Roman Catholic Church keep their treaty with Germany after knowing what was going on? And I'll piggyback on that to ask you to elaborate on your statement that Pius XI sanctioned anti-Semitism among Catholics.
Yeah, okay. So, well, let me just say that, the error was allowed to exist for 4 years, right? So the treaty is 1933. The papal encyclical saying that the treaty was a mistake was 1937. But if you read the encyclical, which is called With Burning Sorrow, Pope Pius XI attacks Nazi totalitarianism. He does not attack Nazi anti-Semitism. And this probably reflected the, kind of strange politics of the Roman Catholic Church, that there were many Roman Catholic clergy members, particularly in Poland, who were bitterly anti-Semitic. And so kind of Pius is, at this moment that demanded bravery from him, he's being diplomatic instead. He's aware of his constituency. And then it's his successor, Pope Pius XII, who's in the Vatican when the Jews of Rome are rounded up and is silent.
Steve, thank you very much for joining us this evening. That was a wonderful presentation, and I agree, the question and answer session was truly outstanding. So I thank all of our audience for coming, and I hope we'll see you every week. And we'll say good night for now.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you, Dr. Bittner. And
Yeah,
I'll see my section in 10 minutes.
thanks everybody.
Yeah.
Enjoy the rainstorm.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, stay safe.
Bye-bye.